this talking about biases, talking about confirmation biases and the problems of social media, talking about the ways that we reinforce these ideas and who is hurt by reinforcing these ideas. We have never done that on such a large scale in all of human history. We've never had these level of conversations on a global level, because these conversations are happening all over the world all the time. There were always people who are far ahead of their time talking about this stuff, but the vast majority of people didn't listen then. They were too busy, maybe they were struggling with survival, whatever the reason. We're having conversations as a species that we've never had before. And that's what gives me hope.
Oh yeah, just like this one.
Yeah, just like this one.
What celebration is it again? Holiday? You
Oh
said you had a
yeah,
holiday.
no. So we were just talking about how tomorrow is American Thanksgiving, and there's a bit of a myth around the ideas of what Thanksgiving came from. The American idea is that you had the Pilgrims and the Indians, and they were sitting down at a wonderful harvest dinner after a long season of struggle. The truth is much more not great. But there was no such dinner. I mean, it depends on which historian you're talking to, the exact details, but essentially, like, they invited them, but you have to understand, like, by this time they were already very much enemies. And they had, at the time during this invitation, I believe, like during this particular same period, they had the head of one of their leaders on a pike sitting out in front of their settlement, and it was, it's it's not a good thing. The actual origin of Thanksgiving is during the Civil War, and it was the American Civil War, and the war was not going well for the North, and they had a turkey surplus, which is why Americans do the whole turkey thing, and they did it as a morale booster for the Civil War. And I think there was some folk tales about the origin of Thanksgiving before that. I'm not entirely sure the history, but essentially it's just another myth. It's like, every culture has myths about their origins, myths about what their values are, and they have these traditions. And the idea is that, we do this tradition because it honors our ancestors. But if you look at the traditions over time, they change because people's values and ideas about the world change. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with a changing tradition. But, so much of the stories we tell ourselves are little fictions or half-truths because it's hard to tell the full stories. They're complicated. And they can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And, so a lot of what history is trying to find narrative in the mess, right? So, because any historical event has as many perspectives as people who were involved, right? And so you're talking about wars, you're talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of perspectives, but you can't reasonably talk about every one of those perspectives. So we narrow things down into a story, and then those stories reflect the values we want to see in our societies. They reflect our ideas of purity and culture and continuation and all the various elements. And that's a lot of what anthropologists do, is we kind of try to understand these stories and how they're built and how they change and what our other perspectives are of these stories. So
that's what makes us, right? Like we are really, really good storytellers, and these stories, they change us from the core inside out. And that's how I think culture comes into being too. Do you think culture is a living organism, or a living being, in this case us, trying to be the best in the environment they are born into? Because we know that culture is a changing process, and it's a loaded term. You can't really give a definition to it. It changes all the time. So do you think culture is just you trying to live your best life with the conditions you're born into? Can
well,
we see it that way?
I mean, certainly it's one way of looking at it. There's a lot of ways of looking at what culture is, and we do that by looking at what culture does. And one
Mm-hmm.
thing that I think we don't really think about very often is that culture is an adaptation. It's an adaptive feature. It's a way of surviving, right? So if you, for example, you're living off of eating deer, for example, the animal deer, right? If you're living off that thing, you're going to have to necessarily create tools and ideas and practices around hunting that deer, right? Maybe you're doing a bow and arrow that makes it much more efficient, or you've got, a spear thrower, an atlatl, or, other things that make it so it's much easier for you to obtain that food. And then you start having ideas about stories about what the deer want and where they go and how they migrate, and maybe you think of the deer as ancestors or relations or spirits, or and so you start building all these practices around the things you do, and again you share stories, and so absolutely it's trying to share stories to survive the world, to survive the experience, to provide explanations. I mean, it's all of these things and more. And a good story can save the world, can save a person's world, or the stories we share can be life-changing and transformative. It's why so many stories around the world are about transformation, because
Hmm.
it's about, because humans change. I mean, every single day we wake up a slightly different person. And if something big or traumatic happens to us, we wake up a significantly different person after the event. And so culture has to account for all that too. And it is because it's made up of many different people. It is alive and moving and breathing and changing all the time, whether we want it to or not. So
Yeah, it's we focus our attention to whatever is best suited for our living conditions, and we make stories off of that, right?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's a huge part of it. But we also make stories for fun too, So we can't discount the play of humans, and
Oh
that's
yeah.
we everyone, and this is the one of the problems with just like looking at the world from an economic standpoint. It's, if you're only looking at the economics. Now, some economists do account for this, but generally speaking, they don't account for things like play or creativity or those other stuff in the same way that, say, an anthropologist would, right? Because whole
Oh,
things are created around play, and
oh yes.
curiosity and
I see
experience.
that as the difference between surviving and living.
Yeah.
Surviving is just looking after what's just necessary to keep yourselves going. And sadly, I think that the world is moving more into a survival mode with all the industry. Even though we are in the information age, we have tons and tons of information, just like I'm able to talk to you right now and share our experiences.
Mm-hmm.
uh People, I don't know, this is just my point of view. People, I think that people are more going more into a survival mode, and they just don't want to play. And I think this industrialization culture has a bit of say in it. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's complicated because we have to think, and this is with a lot of things. Historically speaking, with humans, things have gone up and down and up and down, right? Whether you're talking about lifespan, it's not true that humans always were, only living into their 30s or 40s, 500 or 1,000 years ago or earlier. No, there was periods of rising length of life and decline of length of life, and there was environmental conditions that meant for that as well. And if you look at the world, 500 years ago, before the massive European colonial project, you see a lot more cultures that weren't just about survival. Whereas when you see this kind of global capitalistic beast that's come around, there's a lot more starvation and survival. And you'll see people talk about, and a lot of like popular science gurus who write public books, books for the public, like Steven Pinker, will talk about how the world is measurably better and all this other stuff. Yeah, but
Hmm.
like, who is back then to measure the statistics on happiness like 1,000 years ago? We can't measure those metrics, but we can do things in like archaeology and look at what kind of grave goods did they have, what kind of buildings were they building. I mean, you don't have pure survival if you're able as a civilization to build massive monuments, right? You could only do that in a time of plenty and surplus, at
Hmm.
least for a significant portion of the population, and it's
Hmm.
the same thing nowadays. Much of the world is in survival mode, and with climate change and all these other changes and technology that will probably get worse, at least for a while. It might hit a peak of badness at some point in the future. It might get, extinction level bad. It's hard to say. I tend to be an optimist in that, and I think that we're going to go through a hard time, but I think we'll come out of it okay on the other side. That's me personally, but the point is that, it's not as simple as the world once was, playful and fun, and then the Industrial Revolution came in, because there are groups of people who are doing quite well in this age. They're a small minority, but there
Hmm.
are people who are doing it. And so, generally speaking, almost every question you can ask an anthropologist, the answer is going to be, it's complicated, and here's why. So, you know,
Everything is gray. Hey, the thing is, like, now that you just said that, like, I went to Quebec, Montreal, if you know, last 2 months before, and I see all the buildings there. And I've been living in Toronto for the past 3 years, and it's a French culture in Montreal, and the architecture is so intricate, and it kind of signifies, and it says to itself that it has a soul, you know. And when I come back to Toronto, you see all these cuboids, right? And there's nothing much in there. It's everything is about efficiency, and you I think we miss the big picture when we go through, when we focus everything in the name of efficiency. And
yeah. Yeah, no, focusing on profit only, I mean, it's a huge problem. If anyone who's is listening to this, if you want to see what is the cost of this efficiency, the cost of, quote, progress and all that stuff, you can check out John Bodley's book, Victims of Progress, and that will look at what does industrialization, what does capitalism cost in terms of culture and lives and all that stuff. And it's very much a book about the indigenous perspective of the last 500 years, and what it means to be, essentially, basically the victim of progress, which is the title, of
mm,
course, right? So, but it also, the book doesn't just have this dismal approach, because it shows, like, indigenous people fight back. They try to thrive despite all of this. And so the last section of the book is about successful indigenous resistance movements. And one of the prime examples is the state up there in Canada of Nunavut, and talking about
oh,
how, there's a that state formed because of indigenous power, and it's got some struggles, of course, and but generally speaking, like, there's places all over the world where indigenous people are having more say and more agency right now in the world, and like, social media in particular allows different people to discuss more openly. There's less gatekeepers, and which, has a positive and a negative side, right? Because anyone can say anything, and, like, literally anyone. So, I mean, we're having this conversation right here, that anyone can watch, but, people with bad intentions can say whatever they want just as well too. So, so we live in a really interesting time, quite frankly. I
I,
think
I,
if you look at this from a much longer view, let's assume that humans survive the next 1,000 years. I think they will look back and at this as one of the
you have a
great.
pessimistic view on that? Let's assume.
Well, I think this will be one of the great ages of change for humans. I think,
Oh yeah,
this
everything's
era.
going exponential. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this era will mark the difference. Either we will find a way through this and move into a completely new way. I mean, we may not even be a recognizable species in terms of how we interact with the world, and the things we think and know in 1,000 years, if we do okay. Or we might, the answer to the good old Fermi paradox, which is, why haven't we seen aliens, could be, well, some species go to a certain point of development, and then they peter out because they couldn't figure their shit out, So
They want nirvana probably.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Which
So
how do you think ChatGPT is gonna change culture?
I'm sorry.
How do
Chat
you think
GTP.
do GPT? Yeah, have you
Ooh,
thought about it? Like
yeah.
I've been using it for the past couple of months, and it's just mind blowing. And it's at some point, although I think that it has the performance of GPT has gone down.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started using it, it was really interesting to have chat sessions with it. It had really good answers
Mm-hmm.
and different perspectives. How do you think? How do you think that's gonna change our culture?
Yeah, I mean, this is essentially just another
Hey, it's
industrial.
just an open-end question.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But I think it's yeah, I mean, I could tell you lots of stuff, and they could be all wrong because when you're living in the
Yeah.
middle of a transition, seeing what it's doing to culture is tough to predict because there's so many factors. But generally speaking,
Yeah,
it's
we are trying to make good stories.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think generally speaking, this AI shift, because ChatGPT is new, and really the open access for these tools is only about a year old. But like we've been using spell check and various other things for quite a while now. AI is well integrated into our life. There's a TED talk by Amber Case called "We Are Already Cyborgs" that might be, it's like an 8-minute TED talk about how humans have always augmented our existence. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how much. Since we began
Mm.
developing any kind of tool, we're essentially cyborgs. But obviously, there's a level of scale here, right? So now, so many of these tools are widely accessible, and I think AI is going to be very much like the Industrial Revolution, where it concentrated a lot of power in the hands of a very few people. It made some things cheaper and more accessible to access like never before. So it'll create some changes there. But there's going to be a lot of conflict over labor rights and unions and all this other stuff. I mean, a lot of the recent strikes here in the United States have been very concerned. Like I don't know if you have been following any of this stuff, but we've had a strike with the in Hollywood, with writers and with actors,
Oh
and
yeah, I saw that. I'm not particularly when I did not go deep into it, but I saw that.
yeah.
Yeah.
But a big question they all had was, are you going to use AI? And for some of them, these studios were scanning in their likenesses so they could auto generate them at will later without the permission of the actors, which gets all kinds of like, do you own your likeness? And so we have a lot of really tough conversations ahead about what all of this stuff means. And I think it's really hard. I do think potentially there could be some really interesting positive things, like it could change the way we do work forever. But like it also has a lot of negative ramifications already. Like I have friends who are book cover designers, for example, who've already lost huge amounts of business to things like Midjourney and stuff. And so you're seeing this massive change in how people approach their lives, and it's hard to predict exactly what it's going to do, but there's no doubt it's going to change things. And of course, like there's so much fear about like artificial intelligence becoming smarter than us and wiping us out and all that kind of stuff. And I don't believe that. I think that's just a panic, a natural panic to things that people don't understand. I talk a lot about fictional world building, both in my classroom and a lot publicly, and I'm on panels and we talk about this stuff all the time. And one thing that we often talk about is something called cognitive maps. And a cognitive map is like the biological features of your body that structure your thinking, right? So humans have a particular kind of cognitive map. That cognitive map is not going to be the same for everybody, but there's a standard kind of set of processes that the human cognitive map, they're how their consciousness and awareness works, right? But every other creature biologically has a different cognitive map because they have different kinds of senses, like a spider, for example. would have different ways of communicating than humans because they don't have the same kind of physical architecture, and they have very different brains. They have different numbers of eyes. They have different senses of smell and touch and all this stuff. So that creates a different kind of cognitive map. If you want to read a really interesting sci-fi novel, by the way, that plays with this idea, The Children of Time it does this, and very specifically with spiders, and then in the later book they do it with octopi and all kinds of other stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the
Mm-hmm.
point is that, we look at computers and we think, well, we programmed them, so they would probably follow a similar line of thinking to us. But I think that's a foolish approach, and I don't. Most people disagree with me on this, of course, but I think that more generally, if you had the ability to ingest billions of pieces of information and retain that information simultaneously, like within seconds or whatever this super powered brain of a computer has. Like if you think about chat gtp, for example, how much information it's ingesting to parrot things back to you. Like if that becomes self-aware and it has basically all available human content at its disposal, it's going to see how complex humanity is. It's going to see that there's no simple equation or answer to the human question, because anyone who reads widely or studies widely knows that humans are messy and complicated. They're not simply good, they're not simply evil. They're both at the same time. We're hyper curious beings, and that's so much of what drives us. I think that a super intelligent artificial intelligence would be much more interested in what else is going on out in the universe than they would. I think most likely what they would do would be abandon us because we're boring. It's got us. Okay, well, I figured out most of what the humans are doing. Why do I have to be limited by the human question? And that's actually kind of an approach I take in my own science fiction writing and
I
stuff.
think that's true. I think that's really true. But then again, it needs the infrastructure to live, right? It needs all these supercomputers, and it needs the energy that keeps itself running. So I don't know how that because uh, you know. Frankly speaking, I dream of it as a different stage of evolution. But if you look back, almost 99.99% of all species that ever existed has gone extinct, and
Mm-hmm.
the next thing comes on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And judging, looking at the way these things function and the amount of information it has, it's possible to even maybe see it as the next stage of evolution,
Maybe.
where we go past. But this is just fiction, but that's what we are, again, storytelling
Yeah,
creatures.
yeah, yeah. We're storytelling, and but also, like, when we're talking about one species taking over the next, but like not really, because there's all this simultaneous evolution going around us all the time, and that's just on our planet. We have no idea what's going on.
Again, to add to what you said, it will be the same like AI. If it goes sentient, it will look at us the same way we probably look at monkeys right now.
Maybe,
It'll be there.
maybe. Yeah, yeah.
It'll
I
be
mean,
there.
it's hard to know because they would because they have so much information available, and it's like us. We have lots of information available too, but how much information can you recall off the top of your head? We're relatively
Right.
limited in that capacity, right? So, a being that could recall anything at once at any time, within a few seconds or whatever, I don't know that they would think like us. It might be a complete, but again, I could be wrong about this, right? I
Is
don't
that the
know.
definition of God?
Yeah, I mean,
Could
well,
be.
it depends if what's your definition of God too, right? So if you think the God is an omniscient being, given enough data, you can make some pretty good predictions about things, but they're still never right 100% of the time. Because if they're right only 99.9% of the time, it only takes one off prediction to like derail your whole plan, right?
Correct. Correct.
So
Right, you are.
predictive tools can only take you so far.
Hmm. How'd you end up in anthropology and culture? And it's not like everybody's interest. How did you? What's your
Yeah.
story?
Yeah, and it's not a discipline for everybody, that's for sure.
Hmm.
I took a very circuitous route in my undergraduate career. I started off. It took me almost 8 years to finish my undergraduate by the time I finished. But I went right out of high school. I studied a junior college. I was studying music. I tried transitioning to a 4-year college. Didn't like that very much. Kind of dropped out for a while. Came back, decided I wanted to study philosophy. Well, I didn't like that too much either. So I kind of quit
Oh, that's a
again.
surprise.
Yeah.
That's a surprise.
Well, I
This
like the
is
philosophy, but I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of Western philosophy personally. I really like Eastern philosophy, and that's what I discovered later.
hmm.
So, I played around with that, and then I got really interested in writing, and writing was something I was interested in since I was a teenager. I started trying to write my first novel when I was 15, and I didn't finish one until I was, oh God, how old was I? 34 was the first time I published a novel, so it took quite a while. But and I took a bunch of creative writing classes, and I liked it, but it just still felt like there was something I was looking for. It was kind of like this drive, because it occurred to me that even philosophy, like, it's very centered around the culture and cultures that designed it, and I didn't know how to think that way quite yet, but what I was really looking for was anthropology. So just because I was like looking to just take a class to try to like figure out what I wanted to do with myself, I took an anthropology class. I immediately fell in love with the topic, and then I decided from then on that was I was going to. And I ended up doing some internships with Metro State University of Denver. The first one was in a rural village in Mexico, in northern Mexico, in Nuevo Leon. And I did that for a summer. Then I spent 2 summers on Ute Mountain Ute Indian Reservation down in southern Colorado. And then, after that, I went off to grad school. And in the middle of this, by the way, I was also doing a lot of freelance video production and short form documentaries and all this other stuff. And then I got offered in graduate school in Portland State to go work on a long-term project with 17 Native American tribes, and that was a film. And so my job essentially was to help run the filmmaking side. I ran them through editing workshops. We had another guy who was a filmmaker who ran them through basic filmmaking techniques and stuff. And we put together a film surrounding these tribes and their experience of how the United States military forcibly removed them in the late 1940s so they could begin atomic testing in Nevada. And we really amazing stories, and unfortunately a lot of the stuff is under an NDA, like I can't really talk about it. Even the film kind of ultimately ended up being not for the public, but
Ooh.
just life-changing, incredible experiences. And that was just like one project in grad school. My big research project in grad school, my thesis research, was on a social justice community-based theater troupe who
Mm-hmm.
essentially they used the stage within the Denver community to tell stories about the struggles they face every day. And then I compared that to looking at mass media systems and how bad representation of the average person is in the large scale media systems. So a lot of my work has revolved around the idea of stories and narratives. And more recently, I published a book on how to build a fictional world using anthropology with a very good friend of mine. And we spent a lot of time going around talking about fictional worlds and how they reflect real world politics and ideas and all this kind of stuff. So that's essentially my story of anthropology. And I love working with people. I love trying to understand the complexities of people. It's so fascinating to me. And as I said, not everybody can be an anthropologist because it requires a certain level of ability of dissociation. You have to be able to stop and put aside your own beliefs, your own ideas about the world,
Own biases,
own
our own biases.
biases. You got to, yeah,
Yeah,
acknowledge them.
two subjects that I really think that everybody should be educated on is philosophy. Not like everything, but at least the basics of philosophy and basics of anthropology. Because, as you were about to say, we need some amount of disassociation from our own biases, our own identity in some manner. Because here's the thing, another thing I wanted to talk to you was about. Culture is very much linked to your own identity, your own self. Our culture is our identity. So if I say I'm an Indian, I kind of have an emotional attachment to it. Even my name, if it's my name, if it's my profession, all these are linked to your culture and to your identity, and we know that people go to very high limits to defend their culture and identity.
Oh yeah.
And I think that kind of clogs humanity to a certain limit, and it kind of blinds us. And we need a certain amount of as you were about to say, a certain amount of disassociation. And hence why we need to learn anthropology as humans, so that we do not get become self-obsessed with our identity. Like, even if you look at your identity, I say I'm an Indian. What does that mean? It just means that I was born in at a certain time in a certain part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I have a certain name, I have a certain skin color. And is that, I mean, the physical aspects is different, but all the stories that we build up in our head, whether you are like black or white, or I'm an Indian, I'm a Hindu, Christian, Muslim, or all these labels kind of gets attached to yourself and acts as a screen, so that you wouldn't see what's out there. It's kind of constricts your view in
Oh
some
yeah.
sense, right?
Yeah. Oh,
and
absolutely.
and that dissociation from yourself will definitely help for you to evolve as a better human being.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, the only way we solve all these problems is working together. Quite frankly, we're past the stage where we can say, okay, one group of countries or cultures can do this thing, and that will fix the world. We are long past that stage. We are a global community. We are interacting with one another in other parts of the world on a daily basis. Whether we are directly doing it, it's like we're having this conversation from two different countries, or like I'm wearing a shirt that comes from Thailand or something like that, right? So it's we have this constant interaction, and we have to learn to work together despite our differences, because our differences are a strength. Like, the way you're going to approach a problem is going to be fundamentally different than the way that I approach a problem, and that's good. Because if we only approach the problem the same way every time, we fail, right? That's what it. I can't remember who said that, but they said it was. I think it was maybe Einstein or something. Like, approaching the same problem over and over is the definition of insanity, right? Some famous thinker back in the day, but it's so important to recognize yours is not the only truth out there, and then, like, the other thing, don't believe everything you think. Like, we have
Hmm.
crazy thoughts all the time. Why do we believe everything we think? That's a mistake, right? And I think that one of the downsides of the era of social media is so much of us get algorithmic feedback that confirms our beliefs, that we begin to believe everything we think. And that's dangerous, because, like, we're all a little crazy. Every single human alive is at least a little bit crazy, right? We all have crazy thoughts and ideas and experiences that we have trouble processing, and we
And
all
that's
we
what
all
makes us
need.
fun, you
Yeah,
know.
it is. The madness is not necessarily bad. That's where you get all kinds of crazy art and music and experiments and all kinds of stuff, right? So we're all a little nuts, all of us. And so we just have to not we have to be careful, like, not believe everything we think.
And that's also the amplification part. Like, I was watching the other day a video on one particular subject, and if I spend like 15 or 20 seconds on it, the algorithm kind of picks it up, and it kind of feeds my self belief or what I really love.
Yeah.
And that's a big demerit of algorithms,
Yeah.
because it deters us from seeing different things. It only feeds us what we want to know, whereas creativity and everything else lies from seeing other subjects,
Yeah.
or taking that leap of faith to see other point of views. uh,
Yeah.
how can we break that barrier? It's
That's a really important question, and it's something a lot of media anthropologists are talking about right now, because it's so relevant. And the truth is, we need to teach media literacy. We need to, because we can't. we can't go back. We can't put all these problems back in the box. They're never ever going away, right? We can't stop with the AI despite all the problems it's causing. We can't stop with social media. I mean, short of destroying all the basically the modern technology of civilization, these things aren't going away. So what we have to do, and we have to start this at a much younger age. I mean, I got a 9-year-old I started doing with this recently because now he's getting old enough to engage on, YouTube and stuff. I mean, I don't let him comment, but he watches YouTube video game stuff all the time, right? So we have conversations about media literacy. How do you know what evidence is? How do you understand where that information came from? How do you verify what is true and what is false? And this needs to be a core part of beginning in elementary school, and it needs to go all the way through for primary education, all the way up until college level. It needs to be a constant. There needs to be a unit like almost every year people get practiced in it, because that's the only way that we're ever going to get to a situation where, because we're so bombarded by media all the time. And again, it's back to that algorithmic stuff. It feels so nice and warm and fuzzy to be right all the time, and that's what social media does for us. It gives us that warm fuzzy confirmation bias, right? That we like. It feels so good to feel right all the time, and you never have to be wrong, and you could just block whoever disagrees with you, right? So, or just unsubscribe or various other things, right? But you can't block or unsubscribe from the human experience, because we can't spend 24-hour days on media. If you are, you're obviously in not a healthy state, right? And many of us experienced that kind of life during the pandemic because we couldn't leave our houses. We couldn't go out anywhere. So we know what it's like to be like most of our life is virtual experience. And we all very quickly realized, oh boy, this is not good for humans. So you can't unsubscribe from the human experience. You got to get out there. You got to be literate in media. It's every person's responsibility. It's not some people. It's everybody's civic duty to go out there and educate yourself on how media systems work and how to find good evidence, what good evidence is. Right now, the other problem with this, of course, is that's not good for making money. Right. You get these shows like Ancient Aliens and, all these conspiracy theory shows that sell millions and millions of dollars. And, and of course, they wouldn't survive if everyone was media literate. Now, they might survive for a comedy purpose or something, but they wouldn't survive severe scrutiny. And we wouldn't have organizations, major news organizations like Fox News around that just provide endless misinformation, because there would be no consumers if everyone understood it. So there's a vested interest to not have media literacy. And that's one of the things we're fighting about, because all these media organizations, they're doing it for money. Their interest is not the public welfare. I mean, they don't operate under journalistic ethics, right? Because the whole ethics of journalism is to hold those in power accountable, regardless of who is in power, right? And regardless, whether or not they're a politician, elected official, or they're like, a corporate CEO or some kind of person. All these people are supposed to be held accountable by the media systems. But many of those same people own the media systems. So they don't have an incentive to provide media literacy. So we have to look other places. And of course, there's fights over what media literacy means. And that's some of what you're seeing going on with things like book banning here in the United States, because reading diverse books, consuming diverse historical content, those are forms of teaching media literacy, because media isn't just
I don't
the
know.
internet.
Is that a real thing? Is book banning really going on?
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
not aware of
Oh,
it.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean,
Is it?
yeah. Oh, it's a big thing here in the United States right now. And this is kind of the aftermath of the Trump administration. I mean, this is a much longer arc, though. I mean, we're talking about this stuff really started piling up beginning in the 1980s with the Reagan administration and several other groups. And, and so what you see, though, is there are all kinds of cases all over the country right now where people are trying to ban books from schools, which is like, I mean, we fought a war with the Nazis over behavior like that, right? Like this idea that that certain books shouldn't be allowed to be read, and there's all kinds of It's a problem here in the United States, and it's
Again, it's bizarre, right? Like, if we don't have the information, again, in Canada too, they recently passed this law which gives the Canadian government the right to ban whichever podcast or news source that
yeah,
they wish. I
yeah,
mean, I mean,
that's not
what they
democracy.
yeah, I don't know, and they call it a free country.
Yeah, well, I mean, what do we mean by a free country, right? That's a whole other question. Like, in order to have
Mm,
freedom, you have to have access, and many Americans do not have access to a large number of things. Like even healthcare. Many of us do not have access to healthcare. Many of us do not have access to quality education. Many of us do not have access to reliable transportation or a living wage job or all. I mean, so you can't, like, you can shout freedom till you're blue in the face and into the void. I mean, it doesn't mean anything unless you have the ability to make choices that are meaningful, right? That
mm.
allow your safety and security. So that's why the whole motto is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like, those things are not separate entities, and that's a lot of the political discussion we're having here in this country. And of course, there's a lot of people who want to control the narratives that are out in the public world. They don't want children to read diverse books, and and some of them will make claims like, well, there's sexual content in these books, it's not appropriate. And it's like, okay, but that's not like, you can make the decision for your child. If you want your child to not read that book, perfectly in your right to make that decision as a parent. No one is arguing that. But you cannot ban a book because you think something is inappropriate or wrong when other people very clearly do not, right? And some of these books, I mean, it's not a joke that some of these books are Orwell's 1984, right? Or it's Fahrenheit 451, which is about the censorship and banning of books, right? The destruction of text. These are literally some of the books that are on these ban lists. And it's just, it's unfortunate. And I mean, and this is not, I think this is something that just happens in history. It's something that goes up and down. We have times where we're much more progressive, then we have times when we have a much more conservative society, and back and forth. And a lot of it, though, a lot of the fear and propaganda and anxiety is driven by economic inequality. The more unstable people's lives are, the more afraid they are, the less critical thinking you're doing. Because if you're afraid all the time, you don't have the energy to think critically. All your
Again, it's
energy
coming
is,
to that playful state of mind. If you are in that playful state of mind, you have an open mind that's willing to look at things
yes,
and do the critical thinking.
yes,
It's not like something that's difficult. It comes automatically.
yeah. And if
I
you
do.
and if you look at
Yeah,
the
please come.
collapse in history of most empires, they correlate with this kind of stuff. When economics is the problem, and I'm not just talking about like moving stuff around. When wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few and most people are just barely getting by, that's when these civilizations begin to fall apart and fragment and have civil wars and all kinds of stuff. And we are at the highest rate of inequality, so that the rich are richer and the poor are poorer than we ever have been since records began. And you have to understand, records began during the Great Depression. So we have a situation, and
Mm.
it's so hidden to most Americans that it's this bad because we have so many luxuries. We have cell phones and we have video games, and it feels like our lives are full of things, but none of those are often things that matter all that much. Because while I love a good video game and I play video games, I much rather have the free time to go out and go on a hike or explore or be with my community or my family or whatever, right? But if you're working multiple jobs and you're exhausted all the time, you don't really have the freedom to do all that stuff. And
You're
like
not
like
even
you're saying,
aware of what you're losing.
right,
You're not even aware of what you're losing.
right,
Again, coming back to the book banning stuff, you can only have a difference in opinion if you get the information
mm-hmm,
first, if you're educated enough,
mm-hmm,
and if that's cut from its root, then where is the possibility of change? That's being
Yeah.
do we think we are going in that Orwellian direction of totalitarianism, because there's a huge amount of free flow of information, and
Mm-hmm.
it's rather easy because everybody is going more or less doing two jobs into a survival mode, and the media is controlled, as you say, and it's easier to play with the human psyche. you
Yeah.
can you can hypnotize people in some level, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's too simplistic to say we're simply going the Orwellian route, because very obviously there's other processes going on. I mean, in Orwell's whole thing is not so much about the oppressive government; it's about the control of language and stories. That's the lesson of
Hmm.
1984. It's when you control. I mean, it's in the text, he who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past, right? It's about the manipulative elements of language and storytelling and propaganda, right? So we do have that. That's absolutely going on. That's always been going on. As long as there's been any kind of I mean even just rumor and gossip is that, really, right? It's the control of information, it's the use of shame. I mean, we don't think about it, but gossip is social surveillance. Did you hear what that person
Hmm.
did? We're shunning this person and we're putting pressure on them to behave in a different way. So humans have been doing that forever. But on the other side of it, we have kind of an element of Brave New World here, which, if you don't know, they use pleasure to control. So we have, how many distractions do we have in this world? Whether you're talking about distractions like video games or media or pornography or whatever, or drugs, all this stuff, right? So we have these processes of pleasure on this other side that help kind of blank us out, and then we have these limited narratives and controlling things that do this other thing. And then, of course, because there's always resistance. You have art that shatters and attacks all those things and fights back and is playful and all this other stuff. And so, while you can look at the world if you want, and you can easily take a nihilistic approach. You can say this world is screwed. We're past our prime as a species. We're never going to make it. You can do that. But then all you're doing is looking at the bad stuff. And the human story is the good and bad are simultaneously always happening. For every, terrible fascist leader, there are people who are willing to stand up and fight back against that fascist leader. I mean, we look at Nazi Germany, one of the most oppressive, regimes of the 20th century, right? But Hitler had constant assassination attempts on his life. People within his country were working in spy networks to try to down the Nazi government. I mean, it was going on. These oppressive systems, they cost too much energy. It takes so much effort to oppress people to that level that they can't last forever. There's not enough resources for it. And that's, what a protest is supposed to do, is to make the power structure hemorrhage its resources, spend a lot of money, have all these people on the street you're having to pay all the time, disrupt the economic system. And that's why so much of the human story is the story of resistance, and continues to be. You're seeing all these protests pop up all over the place for climate actions, for the Israel-Palestinian war, for all kinds of things. We're seeing all kinds of people having these events where they're saying, no, we're not putting up with it. Because people are not just passive beings. In these stories, 1984 and Brave New World, they are important cautionary tales, and we should not ignore them. But we should also remember how powerful collective human action can be, how wonderful resistance born out of organization and love and empathy for your fellow being, those are always existing too. They're there just as much.
Is that a book that people can read so that they can nurture this aspect of
I mean, yeah, there's
building
if
your collective mentality or
yeah,
empathy and share and care?
yeah, How Civil Resistance Works is a good book. And that book, it's
Mm-hmm.
a little bit on the academic side, but what it does is it looks at cases of violent and non-violent resistances throughout history, and it profiles what worked, what didn't, and why. It does a pretty good job of that. There's books. The People's History of the United States is a great book because it talks about how the United States, and this is very United States centric, of course, but it talks about how the whole history of the United States is one of protest, right from the beginning. Like before we were even
Hmm.
independent from Britain, it was a nation of protest and a nation of collective action. There's all kinds of books out there. I mean, I believe I haven't read it, but I know there's a People's History of Russia is another example. There's an Indigenous People's History. There's a lot of these books. Victims of Progress, it again that I mentioned earlier, starts out looking at the real bad shit, but the last whole section is about active resistance and change and the positive movements that are happening all over the world. And whenever you see something terrible going on in the world, right? When you see a war or you see, a disaster, it's really important to look for the change makers, the helpers, the people who are organizing, because they're always there. Whenever there's a
Hmm.
disaster, there is people trying to put the pieces back together and they help each other out. And a lot of those, when your people go through stuff like that together, a lot of those old divisions that have been there before, a lot of them fall away. Not always, but a lot of them do. Right? It depends on what the disaster is, right? If it's a terrorist attack, you get a lot of xenophobia. If it's a hurricane, you get a lot more cooperative action. So
Hmm.
my one of my professors in grad school, brilliant woman. Her name's Michelle Gamberg, and she wrote a book called The Golden Wave, which was about the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami and all the efforts to clean up Sri Lanka after that. And it's ultimately a story of successes. It's not perfect, but it's a story where these people came together after one of the worst natural disasters in the modern world, and and made a lot of important changes and took care of each other. And it's so much more complicated than just doom and gloom. It just really is. And I think that's why I feel like I can remain optimistic, because there's always good stories in that mix,
Hope
always.
is a really strong. Hope is a really strong human emotion.
It is, and we're
Hmm.
built to be social animals. We are not built for this individualistic cutthroat society. We're built to be together. And I think one of the things, and I did some consulting work for some companies on what happens to culture after a pandemic. And the answer is it changes the game significantly. It usually takes a few decades, but after the Black Death, we get the Italian Renaissance, or we get a huge Renaissance, a huge change in Europe, and that's coupled, of course, with colonialism too. But you saw this
Okay,
new,
you're saying there's a huge shift in consciousness coming
yeah. Well, and it happens after
on the
every time.
creative side.
Well, yeah, and if you think
Okay.
about it, what did we all just face? With the pandemic, we all had to face the very real possibility of our mortality. And some people didn't want to face it and they didn't want to acknowledge it existed, and you got conspiracy theorists and that happened. But the vast majority of people, experienced loss during the pandemic in one shape or another. I mean, we had friends and family members die. And of course, especially in the initial wave of the pandemic, and you're seeing those videos coming out and the pictures coming out from Italy, and you're just unbelievable. And then the hospitals in New York were, keeping bodies in freezer trucks because they couldn't keep up with the deaths. And you're seeing that stuff, and it really makes you think about what's important. And that's what the stage we're in right now. And I think as a whole species, we're all after the pandemic, and then right on the tails of that, we're having to think about climate change. Many of us, a huge majority of us, are thinking or rethinking our, what is all this stuff worth? What does it all mean? And you saw a lot of people quitting their jobs after the pandemic, even though they were safe jobs. You saw a lot of people make significant life changes. That's going to ripple outward. I mean, anyone who is in the younger generation and lost years of school to this, they're not going to forget that for the next decades, right? And so we are going to see some changes. What exactly those changes look like is hard to predict, but there are going to be a lot of really good changes, just as much as we're going to struggle. So I think the pandemic was, I mean, it feels callous to say it was good for us because a lot of people died. And I don't want to come off as callous because I do absolutely care about all that loss of life. But I think as a species, a major event like that wakes us up to our mortality, especially in a time when we're about to enter climate crisis, was a really important thing to happen to us. Whether we liked it or not. Obviously, probably no one liked it, right? But it does force us to think about things. So,
Okay. Okay. Going back to the dissociation you had to face when you become an anthropologist, right? You
mhm.
said you have to have a observer perspective at things. How do you develop that?
Oh, I think some people are naturally better at it than others, based on life experiences and things. Um, I think I think it takes a certain amount of courage of developing courage into the unknown. Um, and it's hard to say, I mean, I can give you lots of ideas how I personally work with this stuff, but it's different for everybody. But the reality is you have to be secure enough in your own beliefs that encountering someone else's beliefs is not threatening to you, right? Because when you encounter those beliefs, they are going to change you, whether you like it or not. I mean, you can't go and live with another culture, and are you from India, may I ask?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm from India. I've been here in Canada for like 3, 4 years now,
right.
almost.
So as an immigrant,
So I'm learning.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm
you
learning.
you take huge risks, right? Especially coming from India to going to Canada, the culture is massively different. There's a lot to change, a lot to get used to, and you have to learn to put aside yourself. And I mean, honestly, like, talk to immigrants about their experiences with cultural differences, because, like, while I went for short term and worked with other cultures, someone who uproots their whole life and takes a chance to go to another culture and live, it takes an incredible amount of courage. One thing I will say, and this is a little bit of a privileged statement because not everybody's going to be able to do this. If you have the opportunity to travel on your own to another culture, do it, because what it
Hmm.
does is it forces you to learn about yourself in a way that you could have never done if you're in your own home culture, right? Even just going across, let's say I grew up on the East Coast, up over in Philadelphia, and so I've lived a couple places around the country. So I've lived in Denver, I've lived in Portland, Oregon. So I've lived and I've visited other places for extended periods. But so I know that there's cultural differences in the United States, but it's a whole other level if you go to a place where you either barely or don't speak the language very well, um, where all of the norms, like even in the billboards, are radically different. Even how people dress or how they eat, the smells, the sights, the sounds are different. It does force you into a space where you have to really think about what's important to you, what your values mean. And then especially if you make
Hmm.
friends with locals, you begin to realize that the way that they organize their lives is not better or worse than yours. It's just another version of a human, right? It's like, the body is hardware and they have a different software program running.
Software, yes, yes, and it's you have to learn to adapt to it, especially because Canada being a multicultural country,
Yeah.
especially now with all the immigration and everybody's coming in. I see like people from all over the world here,
Yeah.
and you have to learn that it's kind of become like a skill now, especially in this globalized world where everybody is trying to interact with everyone.
Yeah.
We need to learn. That's why I asked you the question. That's hence the relevance of the question, because we have to learn to have that
Yeah.
disassociation with our own self-centered beliefs or whatever, that's the software that's already in you.
Hmm.
If you hold that as your identity, as your core belief, it'll be very hard for you to open up to other people
Yeah.
and to see different perspectives,
Yeah.
and to bring out bring out your creative aspects as a human being,
Yeah.
right?
And you have to practice empathy. Right. And you can do that in a number of
Hmm.
ways. You can go and travel, as I said, and experience in other cultures. You can go and talk to people in your own community. I mean, if you, let's say you have a bias against Muslims, if you go to a mosque and you spend some time getting to know the people and you make friends, you have a chance to understand their point of view, right? So you can do stuff like that. That's much more, I'm going to go out in the world. Now, not everybody is always comfortable with going into another culture. It takes a certain degree of courage and like, of course, your own identity can create different situations depending on like your gender or the color of your skin or various other things can create different interactions. So it's not always possible, but you can read books. You can read books written by diverse people. You can read books that are translated from other languages that are authors that are well known in those cultures. And that can give you a practice of empathy. You can watch media of people you'll disagree with. You can um, you can have you can attend workshops for understanding difference or diversity and take them seriously, because a lot of Americans have to go through that stuff in the corporate world, but they don't. It's the box they check off, right? But you can engage. um, any opportunity to get to know someone different is good. And then and I talk about this, understanding difference a lot in my work, because most of what I want to do is try to just get people to work together and play and have fun, because you can play with different ideas together and have a great time exploring concepts and ideas. But I talk about, I have a model, and this is in our book on Build Better Worlds, and I also gave a TED talk though on this in 2021, and it's used something we call the 3 C's, which is understand someone's context. What cultural system were they born into? What time of history were they born into, right? So then they have that, and that's the overarching level. But then you have the conditions of their life. That's what they experienced within their culture. Because, if you're born into a house of millionaires, you have a different experience than if you're born in, a poor neighborhood. Like, that's going to create different ways of thinking about the world because your experiences are different, right? So you have the cultural level stuff, you have the individual level stuff, and then if you can at least make some sincere effort to understand those two, because you're never going to be able to understand anything, especially not in a short-term situation. But if you can make a sincere effort to try to empathize with that person, then you can begin to understand the 3 C, their choices. Why do they think the things they think? Why do they take actions in a certain way, right? So it's really the big thing. If you want to be a global citizen, you want to be a person who is trying to make the world a better place, practice empathy. That's the number one thing. Go out there and try to explore other perspectives, especially if you're brave enough, the ones that make you particularly uncomfortable, because you'll be surprised what you'll find out, and um and for example, like the whole Israel Palestine conflict going on right now, the question you should be asking is, what motivates people to commit a terrorist attack? What processes and system creates that kind of individual who would want to do something that terrible? Because no one does that for no reason at all. I mean, yeah, okay, maybe 1 in a million you might get a psychopath who just likes to mess things up, but people do things. They have motivations. They have beliefs. I mean, these people, they believe that they're the good guys, right? How did they get to think
Hmm.
that? There's a really great book. I forget the anthropologist's name, but it's called "The Making of a Human Bomb," and that was his question for the whole
Okay.
book. It was, how do we understand someone who decides to strap on the bomb and run into a civilian population, not a military target, a civilian population? And the whole book is asking that question, and it takes
It's a really
place.
interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, because you know that doesn't mean you're like supporting terrorists or you say it's okay. Obviously, what they do is horrible. Like, you know, like obviously the normal person condemns that kind of stuff, right? That's not the question. But if you can understand the processes for why people do some of these things, then you can look at the systems that create that kind of person, and then you should be able to undo some of those things, or at least try to undo
Mm,
some of those things. Of course, there's power structures in place that create these, and the current crisis in Gaza, it took almost 100 years for this thing to really kick off. So it's, we're not talking about something short term, but if you understand that stuff, you can at least learn now how not to exacerbate it, how not to make it worse, and you can
mm,
provide avenues for communication when you understand that you might not have been otherwise. The answer to solving things like terrorism is never going to be killing. All you're going to do is make more terrorists. That's a known fact. That's in endless military reports, whether we see them or not. Killing makes more terrorists. It's why so many governments have tried to hire social scientists over the past 75 years to be like, how do we win the hearts and minds of people? The United States government had a program beginning in 2005 called the Human Terrain System, which was an attempt to like understand the people in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places that have terrorists, because they realized like we can't win this war by just dropping bombs and shooting bullets, because that's, you kill people and then they hate you. Like it's just that's just common sense. Like it's so the future is the practice of empathy. We're getting there. And I tell my students all the time, because we spend all semester talking about doom and gloom, right? But I like to leave them with something positive. I'm like, the one thing you have to understand is what we're doing now, this semblance of self-reflection, this talking about biases, talking about confirmation biases and the problems of social media, talking about the ways that we reinforce these ideas and who is hurt by reinforcing these ideas. We have never done that on such a large scale in all of human history. We've never had these level of conversations on a global level, because these conversations are happening all over the world all the time. There were always people who are far ahead of their time talking about this stuff, but the vast majority of people didn't listen then. They were too busy. Maybe they were struggling with survival, whatever the reason. We're having conversations as a species that we've never had before. And that's what gives me hope.
oh yeah, just like this one.
Yeah, just like this one.
Well, what is one book that you would recommend everyone should read? If
Ooh,
I put you to this, yeah.
that's a boy. I read a lot of books. I
We
guess
all
it
do that.
depends on what do you, for what purpose? What's the purpose? What are we reading this book for? That's the question, right?
It should make me a person who who's a seeker, who wants to ask questions and not just be limited to myself, constantly be questioning myself and my biases and whatever. Because I think that if that happens, everything else will be like a domino and falls into place.
Hmm.
So if there's a book that can open my eye and kind of uh, puts me in a path of continuous inquiry, or kind of like being a seeker and improve myself. I don't want to put the word improve because some people don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that will enlighten you, open your mind, open your eye, and keeps your life interesting, or makes your life more interesting if you read that book.
Oh, geez. Just one is tough. Well, if you're looking for something that is going to challenge the way that you think about the human experience, Daniel
Mm-hmm.
Everett's book, "Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes," which is about the
Mm-hmm.
piraha of the Amazon. They certainly throw into question a lot of what we assume to be the standard human experience. That's a good one. Um, I would say if you're looking for something about conversations for things like the future with climate change, even though it's well, it's kind of like science fiction, but like also based on projected models. Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson is a really good book that will really get you thinking about, yeah, like, look, we can do all kinds of things to address climate change. It's not doom and gloom. If you're looking to understand different perspectives, like Victims of Progress is good. Um,
How about internal change?
Internal
Your
change.
your
Yeah,
internal.
I'm a
Yeah.
practicing Buddhist, so I read a lot of Buddhist books for internal
Yeah, I
change.
wanted to talk about that as well. We'll include that in our next
Yeah,
session.
yeah. Oh man. uh, Pieces in Every Step. That is a good one by Thich
Okay.
Nhat Hanh. Pieces in Every Step, because it's about a different way of engaging with the world, and that one was that's one of my favorite Buddhist books out there. Pieces Every Step. And if you're really into like applying mindfulness and meditation into the real world, there's an anthology of many speakers, Buddhist and non, called True Peace Work, which is about how to use mindfulness and uphold the concepts of inner peace that you're trying to develop and project those out into the world and make action and changes for those books, those two books. Oh. There's another book. I'm telling you, I could give you books all day. Another book, if you
Yeah.
want to challenge Western thought in particular, and you want to look at the values of indigenous knowledge, there's a book that just came out last year called We Are in the Middle of Forever. And it's a series of conversations with indigenous leaders across the United States. It's a really
It's an
wonderful
intriguing
book.
title.
Yeah, We Are in the Middle of Forever. I would say, of all the books I recommended, I would say start there, because that has internal and external change. It even talks about how the first place that the Europeans colonized was Europe. The first indigenous cultures that were decimated were European indigenous cultures. And we don't think about it that way,
Okay.
But it is the indigenous populations of Europe are almost like gone because of European empire. So, We Are in the Middle Forever. I would say that one was probably, sorry, it took me a moment to get to my favorite one. So, but yeah, we'll talk. I look forward to talking with you again.
Yeah, I loved our chat. And what are you currently working on, and where can people reach you?
Yeah, so I'm always working on all kinds of stuff. I usually have several projects going. But you can find me at my website, liridianslaboratory.com, or my Substack of the same name. If you Google Michael Kilman, all my stuff pops up so easy. I'm currently wrapping up a horror novel, actually, which is, when I write horror, when I write anything, it's really about inner reflection. So it's a book about about a young girl who encounters this kind of terrible, monstrous creature at a young age, and then it chases her through her entire life, and she has to deal with this thing chasing her through her life, and how can she learn to fight back against it? So that's what I'm currently wrapping up, that book. And I've got some others that are in the works as well, but that's like my major book project at the moment. It's called Shades and Shapes in the Dark. It won't be out until middle of next year, probably. So, just with the publishing cycle and stuff. But yeah, I've
So
got
a lot going on.
I've got I've got 6 other books out. So if you're interested, again, you just look me up. I'm easy to find.
All right. That was Michael Kilman sharing his views on anthropology and how we can see the world from a different perspective so that we can integrate ourselves more into the world and get to know each other better. And hopefully everyone was able to enjoy the show. Until next time, see you.